Once more into the breach, dear friends. The other day during a live show for the Free Press, I took a few minutes out to complain about the ever-increasing comparisons of Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler and the number of supposedly serious scholars, pundits, and politicians suggesting we're on the brink of fascism. Well, last night in New York City, 20,000 MAGA supporters filled Madison Square Garden for yet another rally in Trump's never-ending arena tour. On MSNBC, the very calm, judicious, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Jonathan Capehart gravely informed his viewers that Midtown Manhattan was playing host to a Nazi rally.
That jamboree happening right now, you see it there on your screen, in that place is particularly chilling because in 1939, more than 20,000 supporters of a different fascist leader, Adolf Hitler, packed the garden for a so-called pro-America rally. A rally where speakers voiced anti-Semitic rhetoric from a stage draped with Nazi banners. When a Jewish protester rushed the stage, the Associated Press reported, quote, instantly, a dozen or more stormtroopers set upon him, knocking him down and beating him as he held his head in his arms. Most of his clothing was torn from his body. Later, he was booked for disorderly conduct. Now, against that backdrop of history, Donald Trump, the man who has threatened to use the military against opponents he calls enemies from within, who has threatened to use the troops to quell what he says are lawless cities, and to use those troops to carry out mass deportations of immigrants, is once again turning Madison Square Garden into a staging ground for extremism.
All right, so quick recap. In 1939, Madison Square Garden played host to a German-American Bund rally, a group of freelance American Nazis who compared Adolf Hitler to George Washington and enumerated various imagined Jewish plots. A 20,000-strong crowd of oafish anti-Semites showed up, while over 100,000 protesters ringed the arena, denouncing the fifth columnists inside. It's worth noting that Madison Square Garden was not the one that you see today and was, in fact, almost 20 blocks north. And that Madison Square Garden also played host to a pro-Stalin rally the same year. But to MSNBC's House historian Ruth Ben Gates, who seems to have abandoned the classroom for a career of calling people Nazis on television, the rally location was, quote, not a casual choice. And this was not surprising, she said, from a campaign that put out an ad promising the creation of a, quote, unified Reich in America, just like the Third Reich. I mean, they didn't actually do that, but let's not get bogged down in too many details. Because as you've surely noticed, as Trump has gained in the polls, a certain mania has gripped Kamala Harris's media surrogates. Look, my bookshelves groan under the weight of books not adjudicating the history of fascism, but just trying to establish a definition of the term. Because as George Orwell once wrote, as used, the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. As the historian of fascism, Roger Griffin, recently wrote, sadly, even after so many decades, Orwell's observations still apply almost everywhere. Thankfully, it's an almost century-old debate that has been finally solved by those who pollute the discourse on cable news. Remember, fascism is just another word for Hitler. You're not meant to think of Mussolini in Italy or Salazar in Portugal or Franco in Spain. In these desperate days before the election, MSNBC has decided to go straight Nazi by invoking a 1939 celebration of Nazi Germany. So let's remember what we are referencing here. The 1939 rally was a celebration of Nazi action, what they had done after 6 years in power. And what had they done? And does it sound like Trump's first term or his promises for a second? Well, the fascism conversation never goes much beyond the slur. So let's have a look. Because by 1939, the Nazis had driven Jews from public life. They'd Aryanized, i.e. stolen, Jewish property. They'd enshrined all of this in the 1935 Nuremberg laws, which effectively stripped Jews of German citizenship. In 1938, they engaged in a nationwide orgy of violence, targeting Jews and their places of worship. They'd murdered hundreds of political rivals from within their own party and arrested thousands of anti-fascists. By the end of their first year in power, Germany had become a one-party state, and its media coordinated by a law that Nazified all newspapers and magazines. And that's not to mention the unrestrained street violence in the lead-up to the Nazi seizure of power, where hundreds of fascists and communists were murdered in the supposedly democratic Weimar Republic. I pointed out the other day that former Republican operative Steve Schmidt complained that Trump's language was no different than that of Julius Streicher, editor of the infamous Nazi magazine Der Stürmer, a publication that was so appalling that even leading Nazis suggested that he tone it down, and so appalling, in fact, that Streicher was sentenced to hang after the war. Here, for instance, is a pretty representative image from the paper of Jews drinking the blood of slit-throat Christian children. Or how about when Charlemagne the God and MSNBC pundit Molly Jong-Fast anticipated Trump putting people in camps, which is, of course, supposed to be redolent of Nazi concentration camps. So how does this play with those who have some family experience with the cruelties of Nazism? Well, only 25% of Israelis polled last month support Kamala Harris's candidacy. The other 75% are complicit in Nazism, I guess. Can the people of Israel, the sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors, a country encircled by eliminationist anti-Semites, can they really not spot a Nazi? Can Trump's Jewish son-in-law and convert Jewish daughter not either? And what if those wearing kippahs flying Israeli flags out in front of Madison Square Garden? Do they not know what's going on inside? So MSNBC is determined that we're on the precipice of fascism. Kamala Harris has said that Trump clearly admires Hitler, and when asked if he is indeed a fascist, didn't hesitate in saying that he was. Look, Donald Trump is boorish, vulgar, quite dumb, often offensive, frequently is beset by authoritarian instincts that should give every American pause. But those who lamented the polarization of the Trump years, the extreme rhetoric that had overwhelmed cable news, have now realized the political utility of old-fashioned scare tactics. If this isn't what's happening, then ask yourself why they don't just say Trump is a wannabe authoritarian, which is something I would actually agree with. Because the smart people have abandoned sober historicism and precision for fear. We're abusing the historical record to influence voters. And if we dilute the seriousness of Nazism as a result, so be it. But it's not that just such liberal uses of fascism and Nazism pervert the historical record. It's also that it's just not going to work. Remember that Hillary Clinton half-heartedly apologized for a 2016 comment that half of Trump's supporters were deplorable, and she ultimately acknowledged it had a negative effect on our campaign. How do the Google historians on MSNBC and those newly minted fascism experts on Twitter think 75 million Trump voters and those undecided voters leaning towards him will react to being called Nazi sympathizers? One final point. In the spirit of ecumenicism, the Trump campaign today is out with a new ad calling Kamala Harris the C word. Har har. In this case, the C word is communist. Ignoring the stupidity and the general vulgarity of the ad, it is, of course, worth pointing out that no, Kamala Harris is not and does not resemble a communist. The key difference here is that there isn't a phalanx of once credible historians, journalists from mainstream publications like the Washington Post, saying that she is. So my advice, which will be, of course, roundly ignored by those whose brains have been poisoned by modern politics, is to leave the Nazis out of it. Because as the great historian Robert Conquest once said, there was a unique hideousness to the Holocaust and Nazism. And I fear that its uniqueness is undermined by the casual habit of calling everything you hate fascist.